Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 222nd episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. As you know, November has been all about parenting with equity and well-being in mind. And today we're focusing on cross-cultural parenting. And to join me in talking about this is Carolina Albuerne Rodriguez, or Caro, as you'll hear me call her. Caro has 20 years dedicated to the third sector. She's been a steadfast advocate for human rights, specialising in issues like refugee protection, human trafficking, torture, and access to justice. Her academic career journey was marked by a focus on postcolonial literature and a postgraduate diploma in conflict, security, and development, which laid the groundwork for her deep understanding of complex challenges. A pivotal achievement in her career was leading the Good Practice and Partnership team at Refugee Action, the first infrastructure dedicated team in the UK to cater to the needs of the refugee and migrant sector. This initiative built capacity within third sector organisations and integrated collaboration, early action, and access to justice while driving systemic change. In various roles, she volunteers from board chair and has gained holistic perspectives on the not-for-profit sector. Fundraising and project development have been integral to her journey, showcasing her commitment to driving meaningful change. Caro says her passion lies in co-creating transformative strategies for secure, stable, and agile organisations. Over 7 years, she supported a team working with 300 organisations across the UK, providing valuable insights into the sector's challenges and opportunities. And her mission is to foster change, bring organisations and funders together for a future prepared and eager to embrace positive transformation. So, Caro, a huge welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're very excited to have you. And I know that you've been listening to the series on parenting with anti-racism, equality, and well-being in mind. So delighted to hear your thoughts today. And I'd like to kick off by asking you, can you tell the listeners what being a parent entails for you? Because, of course, that journey is different for everyone.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the series has been so incredibly interesting and I think important and very timely. So wishing you all the best with the reminder of that. Back to your question, parenting for me, I guess it's unique because of my situation. I think as parenting is for everyone, but I'm a solo mother by choice, which means that, my family is very small. There's just me and my son, who's just turned 4. So it's my full-time job, and it's also, a very desired motherhood, but also not one without its challenges, obviously.
And of course, you've worked for most of your life, Caro, since you were a teenager, and working's been a really cool part of who you are, and you're very values driven and values led. And I think that choice to be a solo parent and raising a child with those values and working, how do you manage it? And how was that journey when you first had your son?
So you can do all the planning in the world, and I guess, other types of families will do and have done loads of planning when they obviously were pregnant or were expecting, to receive their child, whether it's through fostering or adoption or other ways. And I think I did a lot of planning. Like you said, I've always been in work, but my son was born just a few months before the COVID crisis hit. So my plans really were changed very drastically. So I had prepared to continue, obviously, with my job in the UK, but at the time that COVID hit, I was in Spain for my maternity leave, and that meant that I stayed here for quite some time after my maternity leave. So I started working remotely back in 2020 and have stayed in the UK. Have stayed in Spain ever since. So I think all of the planning that I did went out the window. I was planning and had saved up a lot of money, to try and obviously pay for the childcare I was envisaging to need. I had done, virtual tours and of nurseries, and I'd put my name down way before my son was born, because obviously I knew that I would be needing childcare very early on in my parenting journey for being a solo mum and being away from my family, as I thought I would have to be. And obviously then life changed, and I was so grateful that I could finally be working from home, working remotely, and I managed to do that for 3 whole years. So it's been a total unprepared, and also very just not. I haven't really had much control over it, but it's meant that I've been able to be near my family, and that my son has been able to meet near them, and we've been a bigger family than we would have been had we been in the UK.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because you lived in the UK for such a long time. You know, you are Spanish, you identify that way, and there's an element of cross-cultural parenting to, I think, your journey. So, you know, what about that parenting cross-culturally? And you've got your own lived experience, but for others that are parenting cross-culturally, maybe like me, they're diaspora communities, even if they're well established, or they're dual heritage couples. Yeah, what are your thoughts around that kind of parenting cross-culturally?
So I think obviously one of the things that I've learned very early on is that there's a there's loads of pros and cons of being a solo parent. So obviously, in terms of what you expose your children to, what heritage you bring, what you surround them with is very important. It's kind of all down to me. So that's a real great thing to have, but it's also quite a big responsibility. And also, in a way, as you say, even though I do have you know, lived experience of migration and having lived in the UK, for 20 years and which really most of my formative adult life, then it's been really easy for me to bring some of those aspects of my experience into my son's upbringing. I think having studied English as sort of my main degree, and having being a linguist in many ways, I think language has been very important as part of my sort of in bringing up my son. What I sort of set out to do initially was obviously to speak Spanish to him, because I was then going to move back to the UK. And now that quickly switched to me speaking English to him at home, and obviously then him being exposed to Spanish. So I think language, how I communicate, how I have, had most of my professional relationships, most of my, friends and other very special, obviously partner relationships having been done in English as well, means that I do feel truly bilingual. But I think some things are easier said in English in some funny way. So and I can now say that, my son is speaking both languages, alternating them both. And I think, that to me is really important, that he can almost communicate with me in those two languages. Because I guess that's part of who I am and part of what I want to kind of, bring him up to be, this idea, that we can be two or more things, and that identity, my identity is kind of forged by my experiences and to a very big extent the languages I speak. So I think also living in a part of Spain that it's very white and not very diverse, where it's still really uncommon, to see, people of the global majority in any position of power, or sometimes even in the street, does, make me very anxious, about how I am going to be able to kind of normalize and introduce that level of diversity that I have grown up with, I have immersed myself in a way, through my own journey also towards, becoming fully anti-racist. And yes, I think kind of that normalization, that exposure to diversity is something that's very much lacking. So that is something that I'd love to hear, how other parents are tackling, obviously in different parts of the world that are maybe, white, too white or overly white. And also, I think having come from, my last place in, where I lived in London, for 10 years, it's just a real shock, to know that my son goes to a class where there is only one other boy in the class who has dual heritage. Like everybody else comes from white Spanish backgrounds. And that's just very strange to me because obviously I'm very used to, a lot more diversity. So how I'm trying to counteract that is by, traveling, I think one thing, but also by really using some very simple tools like books and quite a lot of, in choosing what they see, what they watch, who they listen to, trying to make sure that that's also as diverse. And I think I didn't think I'd be looking into all of this when I became pregnant, but, the heteronormative and obviously whiteness of the kind of cartoon and picture world is definitely changed substantially from when we were growing up, and now the offer is a lot broader. Obviously, we've got loads of digital platforms that allow us to download whatever we like. And yes, so I'm quite picky in choosing, what I introduce through those means as well. And I think, listening to your previous speaker talking about, it, how we bring up children, to become anti-racist, for example, that just not being racist isn't enough. I really agree with that sentiment. I think we have to actively be very mindful, when we are, especially a young white boy, as I'm raising, essentially, that they do understand about racism early on and that they understand about white privilege, and obviously, how to introduce that from such early ages is a challenge, but I think it's one that we need to, and I need to obviously personally work on, because it's not enough. I also really worry about, his his upbringing as a man, because he's a white man. So I have read quite a lot about, bringing him up as a feminist, and obviously that's also a big part of my mindful parenting, if you want.
And building on that then, because I think we can have this understanding of what anti-racism means, but it's going to be slightly different for people depending on their parenting and their journey and the kind of parents they are and the however people define family. So what does the term anti-racist parent mean to you, and how are you embodying that or trying to embody that in your own parenting?
I think reflecting constantly and calling things out. I think also coming from a society where racism is still very, I wouldn't say it's accepted, but I think it's very normalized. And obviously, in the UK, we have also normalized a lot of, especially the microaggressions. But I think here in Spain, where I am at the moment, microaggressions are just, it's just not even seen, it's kind of totally below water, and I think it's become very apparent to me lately, especially when we talk about, the history of the nation, if you want, of Spain, and when you talk to people about the, empire, the Spanish Empire, and the colonization and decolonization, I think it's just so problematic that people haven't even, begun walking in those shoes, or trying to kind of understand really what it is that, you know, we as a culture or as a nation did, and the power that we had, and how that played out, you know, in so many ways into the kind of society that we are today. So I think, you know, it's you've got to be courageous, and you've got to, yes, maybe sometimes be that person, you know, especially, I don't think I would feel this way if I was living in the UK, particularly because obviously I would be living either in Leeds or London, I suppose. They're my two kind of hometowns in the UK, both quite diverse, obviously not exempt from any, you know, sort of racism, but very diverse, and where communities have been in conversation for a really long time. And obviously, thankfully, over the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen a real increase um, and focus on anti-racism thinking, anti-racism ways of working, and really the idea of where the power lies in society, and how to, you know, break down those barriers. And I just feel like, you know, we have to have those reflections, and we have to bring those into education, in the educational settings, for example. And, you know, sometimes in those conversations with other parents, when they use language that you perhaps, you know, hope they don't acknowledge as being, you know, racist, or those small microaggressions that go, like I said, unspoken of, and go sort of, well, just unseen completely. And I think hopefully my son will be able to kind of learn from that. And I think leading by example, and talking things through, and answering questions, you know. I don't think my son has yet started to talk about difference in that way. But also, I think a lot of it is because there's been lack of exposure. And when I see friends, you know, with children who are, well, either of dual or mixed heritage, and are also in schooling in certain areas in the UK, the way they talk about diversity, or the way they talk about, you know, racism, is just, I can't see my son even having some of those conversations, or even being aware yet, you know, which is, it worries me. So yeah, think.
I think it goes back to that point about language as well, because of course, you know, Spanish is spoken throughout a lot of the globe. And we know that Spanish experiences in Spain are going to be different to Spanish experiences in Argentina, Bolivia, you know. So I think that's another interesting dimension to it. And of course, in Spain, you get so much more news about the continent of South America, which we don't, which I feel is sorely lacking in the UK. So I guess there's also that nuance to it as well, and the kind of the history there, and the indigenous peoples of the continent of South America. Not, of course, we know not all of whom are Spanish speaking, but there's an interesting aspect there that I think we miss out on in the UK. And I think you also said something that resonated with me, which is how will you have those conversations yet? And so it's the yet bit. And because you, with your kind of worldview and the exposure and having a connection to the UK, it's, I guess it's nurturing that, isn't it? And creating a space for him to be able to talk about that.
Yeah. And like I said, talk about, you know, things that he sees as different, you know, because they're not in his day to day. I think that opening that space for asking, curiosity, but also, you know, changing that narrative. You know, I was only just listening to a very quick interview on this podcast, and, you know, as you were referring to, you know, the sort of indigenous communities in Latin America or South America, just still feeling like we haven't had a conversation. And I think, you know, when history lessons come about, if we're still in the UK, that is going to be very much on my agenda, you know, like the idea of history and evidence, and, you know, who's told it, who's had the the power and who's been in the right place to tell it and to put it into the curriculum. And I just feel like Spain's really not, I wouldn't say ready. I think they're just in a real denial about, their colonial background and the kind of ripple effects that has had on those communities. It's something definitely to keep calling out.
And we also know that these things are a journey. And so one of the questions I love to ask people is around workplaces. And of course, we know there's lots of different types of workplaces, but what do you think workplaces should be doing, either in the UK or Spain, to discuss and create spaces to talk about cross-cultural parenting more?
So I think, first of all, there's still very little done by employers, and definitely pretty much nothing done in the third sector, where I've spent most of my career, to support parents and support the parenting journey. So, I mean, that's not to say there aren't good examples somewhere. So please, if you find those good examples, Layla, please bring them to us. I think for those of us, really interested in a thriving, supportive, inclusive, equitable third sector, that is that would be amazing, to have those spaces. I think, ideally, this issue of kind of mindful, parenting around anti-racism and equity would be part of what employers can offer. And I mean that in terms of, support around not only the parenting journey, but the parenting journey when it comes to some of these, issues we've been discussing. So, having those difficult conversations, resources. You mentioned earlier in the introduction to your series about the Bernardo's guide, those ideas that I think some parents from whichever background they are, they might not know they're there. And I think it's just some really simple, even like desk review, if you want, that employers can do. And I think that's an issue that we could also be raised with the Leaders Plus fellowship that I was telling you about, because I think, having been a fellow just last year, and Leaders Plus being one of those newly, well, kind of, not that new anymore, but set up organizations to really encourage and support young, people with young children to thrive in their careers while still having, and enjoying, parenting. I think this is something that they've worked a lot on across companies, the presence of these support peer groups, but also that this is almost integrated into the support that goes out to companies and organizations as a whole for parents or new parents. And I think also building on from the work that you've already done with the mentoring peer program in the workplace, I think this would be very interesting as well in terms of, applying it to the supporting parents in the workplace if there were other peer parents from diverse backgrounds or global majority backgrounds. Because I think that sometimes we think we know what a parent that isn't white is going through, because obviously we read about it. Some people might have friends, who speak to them about it. But I think, having seen the really high rates, for example, of stop and search on Black young boys and young men in London, for example, I cannot begin to imagine what it must feel like for a parent to see their young child walk out the door, with that high risk of that happening to them, and having witnessed and sort of, sometimes intervene, sometimes not, but having bear witness to that, I think, a program that sort of approaches that reality to some parents would really lead to some very fruitful and very strong anti-racist conversations, in the home, where sometimes, the bullying, sometimes, those sort of that ability to kind of other people, that otherness that comes sometimes too naturally when as children, can be turned around. I think that would be a really interesting use of peer support, as well as obviously companies and NGOs introducing that as a real commitment to having an anti-racist workforce, and also looking towards an investment and a commitment to an anti-racist youth and new generations coming through.
Really helpful, very practical examples. And I think your point about peer mentoring, race reciprocal mentoring with a focus on parenthood, I hadn't thought about that. So that's really, I think, very insightful, because it's when people build one-to-one relationships that I think the defensiveness and the discomfort starts to come down, and you see someone as human to human, as opposed to thinking I've got to protect myself. So you do this amazing work with refugee, asylum seeking communities, justice, social justice, and we've talked about your parenting journey. So Carolina, how do you look after your own mental health, and what are your top 3 tips that you want to share with listeners?
Well, I have done better in previous times. I'm not currently at my highest point, but one thing that I have always shared with my teams and with friends and others is what I call, and I'm sure you've come across this in another, if it's not called that, in another way, but the letting go list. So I think the mental load, we don't need to be talking about that. Everybody hopefully listening to the podcast will understand what that means for women, especially. So the mental load is being quite substantial. So what I've tried to do is to, regularly have a list of things that I do, and just, try and be quite honest, and a lot of that obviously involves paid work related things, and some give you more joy than others potentially. Then comes potentially you're one of those people like us who goes on and becomes a volunteer or a trustee on a board. And then, you might even have time to do some hobby and things. And so those are the kind of main things that people can think of. But I think we forget about all of those other caring responsibilities that we might hold. And in my case, I have parents who are getting on in age, and whilst they're still independent, there is a lot of support and care, that needs to happen. And I think that it's also on my list, and sometimes, obviously, in addition to all the parenting things and things that you might do around parenting, which sometimes the list can be quite endless. So putting it all out there, seeing it, and then giving yourself that kind of allowing yourself, giving yourself the right to say, actually, I am letting go of this. And that could be, I take my neighbour's kids swimming whenever I go swimming. Or it could be, I'm stepping down from this board, or it could be, I'm no longer going to be, doing this course or writing this piece of thing or whatever it is. And I think that letting go list for me, I need to do it more often, but it's really powerful because it gives myself permission to build that space that then I need to actually take care of myself and look after myself. I think the other thing, especially as a solo parent, is time out. I think it's very rare that I get, full chunk of time out where I'm not either working or, obviously enjoying time with my family. But I think being really mindful about that and keeping some time where I can choose to do what I want to do is really important. And I think recently, because I've been so tired, I think mentally, I think exercise and sleep, I know they're very basic ones, but I think I was having real problems with sleep. So trying to get that back has been really nurturing, and it's really helped me. And then, getting back into my bits of swimming and just walking more again has been really helpful.
Really helpful tips in that. Yeah, often if I'm really stressed, I will write down what's stressing me out, what can I do about it. So very much like your letting go list. And brilliant. And finally, if people want to work with you, know more about you and what you're doing, please, do share the projects you're working on at the moment and how people should contact you.
Yes, so I had the pleasure of leading a wonderful team for 7.5 years at Refugee Action, which was the last charity I worked with. And I finished that in September. Big shout out to all my great team there. And since then, I am navigating the wonderful world of freelancing. So people can contact me. The best place would be directly through LinkedIn. And the work that I do is really it can be cross-sectorial, but obviously I have a specialist background in sort of human rights work around refugee protection, trafficking, torture, and migrants' rights. And I work across in a number of ways, to support mainly organizations to build their capacity, design services that are truly user-led, and look towards stability of organizations and services. And I'm currently doing a really interesting piece of work with the London Legal Support Trust, those Londoners, which is a really fantastic organization, doing fundraising, so being a funder, but also providing infrastructure support to those advice agencies in London, and reviewing with a colleague their Centres of Excellence program. So that's a really interesting journey about legal advice, and that really resonates a lot with my real passion for access to justice for all. So yeah, that's me for now.
Thank you so much, Carol, for your wisdom, your energy, your very thoughtful approach. We're really, really grateful, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Layla, and wishing you all the best as always with this wonderful work.
And also just to say, it's been a joy to get to know your son and you, and having been friends for a long time, it's wonderful to see you doing this work and being able to be a solo mum as well. And it's really great, I think, for people to hear about that journey as a parent.
Yes, and it's only possible because we create these wonderful support networks, which, as we have discussed before, are chosen families, and those are very important, I think, when raising the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much. And everyone, that is for now, the end of our Parenting with Equity and Wellbeing in Mind. And of course, it is also Disability History Month. So next week, we have got a brilliant speaker, Toby Milden, talking about equality architecture. Until then, everyone, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.